Let's be brutally honest right now. That's a big question.
I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to go to base camp, but they want to go to the very top.
Whether it's here, India, New York.
Civilization was born at happy hour.
That's what wins. That's what stands out. That's what people are interested in. That's what I want to know. The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson.
Hello and welcome to episode 125 of the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Sarah Nolet is an internationally recognised food systems innovation expert, the CEO and founder of AgThentic, a global food and agriculture strategy firm, and co-founder of Tenacious Ventures, Australia's first dedicated agri-food tech VC firm. Sarah has been instrumental in building the early-stage AgTech ecosystem in Australia by advising entities of all shapes and sizes, governments, universities, startups, and more to develop and implement forward-looking initiatives in food system innovation. Sarah is also the host of the AgTech So What podcast and co-founder of Farmers to Founders, a national innovation program that supports Australian primary producers to commercialise inventions and new businesses and gain early access to emerging technologies. Sarah holds a Master's in System Design and Management from MIT and a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science and Human Factors Engineering from Tufts University. We've never had a sponsor on this program before, but when Access Collins reached out to support us, I was already familiar with their software and knew that I could proudly mention them as an excellent platform. With a shared database and availability across multiple venues, these folks are doing some amazing things. Check them out at theaccessgroup.com.au and support me by supporting them. Let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome to the show, Sarah.
Thanks so much for having me, James.
You're most welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on the program today. I'm very excited to get into it. Your background is incredibly diverse, but you've focused around the agtech industry and you're very passionate about the supply chain and what that means ultimately for the end consumer. So I'm really excited to get into the interview today with you. But Sarah, as you know, the first question that I like to ask is a crazy hospitality story or experience that's really jumped out for you that's been memorable. So which one do you want to focus on? And I'd love to hear the story.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it counts as hospitality, but I guess it was transformational or one of the building blocks of why I now work in food and agriculture, despite not really having a background or history in it. I spent a bunch of time in South America living on farms, and that really gave me a passion interest for agriculture and set me on what was at the time a left turn from the defense industry into food and ag. But there was a moment when I came back from living on small farms in South America, and some were organic and some were very tiny, and thinking a lot about provenance and where food comes from, and getting to an American supermarket and just having no idea what to buy and wanting to vote with my dollar, but this one's healthy, but it has too much packaging, but this one has these 17 labels of non-GMO and organic and free from this and gluten-free. And just remember standing there literally paralyzed with how do I possibly solve for these competing constraints? And I guess I left the store pretty hungry and went down a different path in terms of whatever I ate that day. But that moment has really stuck with me in terms of how confusing our food system is and how exciting it is to have new technologies coming in that can help make those decisions easier for consumers, can offer more choice, and can also help farmers be more profitable and more sustainable in meeting those demands.
100%. That issue itself isn't just confined to food products and the food industry, because this concept of having overwhelming amounts of choice or this paralysis of choice is something I think I might have mentioned on the show before. With Barry Schwartz wrote a book. He's also got a TED Talk called The Paradox of Choice. Are you familiar with that one? Because that's an excellent example of exactly what you just described there and the economics around that. Are you familiar with that book?
No, I'm not.
I think you'll love it because it describes that really well, the economics of that and why choice is so overwhelming for us. So that's something that I'd recommend listeners as well who are interested in that particular thing that you just focused on there, being overwhelmed by choice. That's definitely an experience in a retail space, a hospitality experience. Have you got something a little more focused around service or something that's really jumped out at you or been memorable in a service environment? Maybe it's not hospitality, maybe it's retail, maybe it's just another company that's provided excellent service.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things that's maybe different about Australia versus the US where I'm from is the familiarity with customization. And so I know it's pretty normal, at least at home, to get 3, 4, 5 changes to whatever you order. And I remember when I first came to Australia 5 years ago now, the reaction of, oh, could I have feta instead of halloumi or this on the side or whatever it might be that day, extra, whatever, often would get some strange looks. And I think that's changed a little bit now in Australia as well, but I still find sometimes that American view of you can have whatever you want when you want it now is not always how I get the reception in the hospitality environment in Australia, which is, maybe my fault. I should just be less picky.
I wonder what's really driven that particular concept as well. Is it consumerist culture? Is it something else? Is it just that we really do want these things, but our economic environment has allowed us to have so much choice in the products that we consume? Do you have any thoughts on that? I'd love to hear if you do, but that's something that really stands out to me.
Yeah, one thing that's maybe different is just the tip system. And in the States, you're working for tips, and that's a big part of the service industry and hospitality industry. Now, I'm sure you have more views than I do on whether that economic system is better or not, but the kind of consumer is boss mentality, part of that is driven by the incentive of getting a tip, I imagine.
I have voiced a couple of opinions on that one before. I don't want to rile people up. I think there are pros and cons for both. I'll keep my answer at that one. There are pros and cons for all options, but I'll move on to the next question for you, Sarah, which is why you do what you do. So what is it that really drives you? What is it that you're passionate about? You mentioned that story there, standing in the aisle with so many options, but what is it that really drives you that's more deeply than that?
Yeah, I mean, when I was on a small organic vegetable farm in South America, pulling weeds in the tomatoes and onions and potatoes, it kind of doesn't take long doing that manually in the hot sun all day before at least I said, oh, I wish technology could do this for me. And you start thinking about all the ways technology could improve the practices. And then it got me thinking about labor standards and fair wages and sustainability and soil compaction and environmental issues and how much chemical use there was. And it really sent me down a rabbit hole, which I still haven't come out of nearly 10 years later, of how can technology and innovation help make our food and agriculture system more sustainable, help farmers be more profitable, and help us create more healthy, affordable, nutritious food for consumers. And that's really why I get up every day and do what we do at AgThentic and Tenacious Ventures, is to help build that food system of the future.
As I heard your answer there, it sounds like what is sitting behind that is really the future of food. What is it that causes that to be your legacy that you're wanting to leave?
Yeah, for me, it's actually probably more about the agriculture end of the supply chain, James, and more of the climate impacts. I'm genuinely concerned about the future of food production and how we can do that sustainably with increasing pressures on natural resources. And technology can help both provide livelihoods for farmers that are doing that production and providing that food, and give us ways to make sure that we're not exploiting the natural resources that we have and able to adapt and be resilient in the face of climate change.
I guess this is a good opportunity to mention that, Sarah, you've got your own show as well, AgTech, So What? So you're interviewing people who are across that. I'd love to know then what you're seeing in terms of innovation happening in that space that you're passionate about in AgTech. What's something that really jumps out to you at the moment that's really happening?
Yeah, I mean, one of the areas we're really excited about that does have a massive impact on climate change and on the environment is carbon and carbon sequestration and the potential of agricultural practices to sequester carbon. One of the challenges with that right now has been it's really expensive for farmers to get rewarded for those practices, and the way the systems are set up don't make it easy for farmers to realize those benefits and for us to measure what's actually happening in terms of soil carbon sequestration. And so an area that technology can help is in that measurement, the verification and validation, but also in the marketplaces, so that tech companies or ag companies or us as consumers can buy those offsets and give farmers an incentive to be doing those practices and be rewarded for that. And so that's an area that technology can help. And it's an area we've just made an investment in at Tenacious Ventures and in a company called Nori. There's many more technology-based opportunities and innovations in that space that I think are really exciting for the future.
Fantastic. And you mentioned that you've made an investment there recently. Before we move on to that a little bit more and some of the areas that you've invested in more recently, I'd like to know, just to flesh out that answer just a little bit more around the complications that farmers do have there. Because you mentioned that the system is quite complicated and obviously it's quite a large answer. But if you could break that down or distill that into a smaller, just subset of maybe a couple of concepts that do make it very complicated for farmers, for those who aren't in that space, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah. So, I mean, right now, Australia does have a marketplace where the federal government will buy carbon credits, and soil carbon sequestration or practices by farmers is one of the accepted ways to draw down that carbon. The challenge right now, or one of a few challenges, is it's really expensive for farmers to participate. And so they have to get a project registered. They have to get basically a mapping of their soil where they dig down multiple meters and pull out a soil core, have it literally like dusted with a paintbrush and put in baggies and put a QR code on it and send off. And so you have to do all of these things to make sure, because the government's the buyer, that it truly is as high a quality credit as you say it is, as in the ton of CO2 is being sequestered. Now that makes a ton of sense, but right now it's cost prohibitive, or in some cases logistically prohibitive for farmers to actually participate in that market. And so where technology can help is giving easier ways to participate and incentivizing the development of more technologies, for example, remote sensing, so you don't have to go measure every part of the paddock and dig up that soil. You can start to say, we've done enough modeling and we'll go in and verify what does and doesn't work. And you can move towards an approach that's much easier to participate. Now, that also opens up a whole nother can of worms, which is different qualities of credits. Just like in other financial markets, we have bonds and ratings with different qualities, with different prices associated with them. That starts to open up the potential for different qualities of carbon credits as well, and different prices associated with them. So that's where the future, we think, is headed. And it gives farmers more opportunities to participate, and it incentivizes more development of those enabling technologies.
Interesting. Was that just a comparison you were making, or you're suggesting that there are going to be bonds for specific projects for carbon? Is that right? Or to, not for carbon specifically, but for those businesses who are involved in that process?
More the analogy, James, of in other traditional financial markets, we have things that have a quality associated with them and therefore are more expensive because they're of higher quality. And so we'll see that in carbon markets as well. And we'll see both buyers and sellers being able to participate at those different levels.
Fantastic. Sarah, tell us a bit more about some of the other investments that you've made that people may have heard of. I know that you deal up the supply chain a little bit more. Is there anything that the consumer might have heard of, or people who are a bit more on the retail end that they might be thinking, oh, yes, cool, I recognize that. Some activity you've been involved in?
Sure. One area that we have made an investment is in insect farming, which has maybe come up before or folks have heard of it. So a lot of insect farming companies globally are looking at producing those insects for food. Some are crickets that might go into cookies, or cricket flour to go into protein bars, whatever it might be. This company is a company called GoTerra. They do produce and are looking at producing insects for food. Their big focus, though, is insects as a waste management service. So what they've done is built some technology in shipping container sized units that can automate the farming of the insects, in this case, black soldier flies, to manage organic waste. So that could be everything from the coffee grounds at McDonald's to the food scraps on all of our tables, to post-harvest agricultural waste, to cafes or multi-unit tenant buildings or hospitals. Right now, we create a lot of organic waste that has a big carbon footprint. We're running out of space in landfills. And one of the big challenges is that right now we have centralized systems. So we have to truck that waste to wherever it can be processed or put in a landfill. Waste is mostly water's heavy. And so by managing on site in these shipping container units and using the insects, you change the economics equation and you can get paid as a waste management provider and have those environmental benefits and waste management benefits for the clients as well. And then as an offtake, the insects that are black soldier fly larvae and become maggots can be processed into livestock feed. So for poultry or fish as an aquaculture, a sustainable feed source as a byproduct of that waste management service.
Excellent. I want to take a step back a bit further. You mentioned you pivoted from defense. What's your background look like? You've done some interesting things and you're in a very interesting space now. How did you come to do that?
Sure. So I'm from Silicon Valley, California. Originally, my background professionally is in computer science and systems engineering, and I worked in the defense industry. I would say I spent the first probably 20 years of my life mostly playing sports and especially soccer. So that was the big focus for me. And there were a few tie-ins there. Thinking about food as an athlete was always on my mind, and what was healthy food, what was performance food or nutrition to be eating. At the same time, when my family would get away from Silicon Valley to go on vacation, almost all of that was spent in the woods and backpacking. And so gave me a focus and passion for the environment. And so when I had the opportunity to take a break from work in my early 20s and take that trip to South America and ended up extending it out for almost a year, all of those dots started to be connected between the technologies that could have an impact, the aspects of food, the aspects of environment. And at the time, globally, agriculture innovation was starting to be on the map. Monsanto, a global multinational, had acquired a company called the Climate Corporation for $1 billion. And that started to kick off a whole series of investments in the agri-tech or AgTech space right at that time as I started looking. And I, like I said, went down the rabbit hole and really have never come back out.
It's still deep in the rabbit hole now. It only gets deeper, doesn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. Sarah, what are you learning about or exploring at the moment? It could be personally, professionally, or something else that I definitely can't even see.
Sure. A few things come to mind. One, on the podcast, as you mentioned, we've been digging into regenerative agriculture and what that means. I'll give you three and you can tell me which one is most of interest to you. Another one is we've transitioned from just having an advisory business to having a venture capital fund. And so we're investing in companies as well, as I just mentioned. So one of the big learnings has been, how do we manage that pipeline? How do we give startups helpful feedback, get back to them in a timely manner, but also manage our limited attention and resources to go deep where we think there's potential of making an investment. So that's an area I've been thinking a lot about. And the third is just over the last 5 years, I started the business by myself. We've now grown. We have 3 different companies and employees. We're not high growth and don't have dozens or hundreds of employees, but I spend a lot of my time thinking about culture and management and team and how to build world-class examples for us, as well as help our portfolio companies to do that as they grow. So those are 3 areas I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Fantastic. I think I might address briefly on what regenerative agriculture is, and then I'll get onto the second one because I think we've addressed the third a lot of other times around work-life balance and managing culture and teams a lot of times on the show. Firstly, though, to go right back to the first one, what regenerative agriculture is.
Well, I guess that's the whole point, James, is that there isn't a definition for it. And that's why it's so controversial. So whereas something like organic has standards, has a definition, you need a certain amount of time to transition, you can do certain things and not do others. Regenerative right now is a term, and some might call it a belief system, some might call it a brand, some might call it a trend or a fad. And what we've been digging into is the various controversies that ensue when consumers want this value system or want practices that are regenerative, want food that is produced in a way that doesn't hurt the environment. And yet for producers, there's a lot of confusion around what regenerative means, given there isn't an actual standard. And now for us as investors and as AgTech experts, there's a bunch of interesting things to dig into there around how can we measure things to prove that water is being used in the most efficient way, or soil carbon is being sequestered, or chemicals aren't being used, et cetera, and prove that to consumers in ways that aren't punitive to farmers, as we were talking about before. But right now it's this big mess of consumers want it. Some farmers totally believe in it. Others think it's total BS greenwash marketing, and it's a giant controversy. You just can put in hashtag regenerative agriculture on Twitter and go see for yourself.
So if that process is a lot more complex, does that mean that your costs account for that, and the sort of process of research that you're doing on behalf of or with businesses or facilitating for businesses to do? Does that mean that those costs are associated because it is more complex and unknown, that it is more costly? Or have you developed some systems to make that process smoother now that can be applied across other different types of businesses?
Yeah, so one of the areas we're looking at is a measurement system to be able to map the outcome you want to see. So I want soil carbon sequestration, or I want ethical or biodiversity outcomes, or whatever it might be. If I'm a brand, or if I'm a government, or if I'm a public agribusiness, how do you actually build a program to help your farmers do something that achieves that outcome? Right now, connecting those dots is really confusing, let alone actually measuring whether the practices they did achieved that outcome. And so that's a space where we are spending a lot of time thinking about, both from a kind of systems change perspective, how can we get more of those measurements happening, as well as from an investment perspective, what companies and startups are able to solve some of those problems and enable a consumer to go, I want this whatever attribute of my food, and I have confidence and proof that is what actually happened at the farm level. Right now, the ways we do that are brands or labels, and our belief is that technology can make that a lot easier and give that confidence all the way through to consumers. And so those are investment opportunities for sure.
Someone said to me recently that technology is leverage. It's not necessarily something that is external to that. It just catalyzes those sorts of things. So maybe stepping back from the technology itself, and I know that's a core component of what you do, but maybe to look at more of the systems end of things, just to round out that question there. Are there any sort of standardized ways you've found to go through that exploration process to find a system to find the systems for other businesses, if that's not too inception for everyone?
Yeah, I would actually say, James, it's kind of a nice segue to the second part of my answer around investing. So we, as investors, don't think technological innovation alone is enough. So you might have that cool technology or be able to prove that something's viable or kind of feasible, you actually can do it. What we really look for in addition is a business model insight. And that really goes to that systems question of, is anyone actually going to buy this? Do you change the economics? Where is value created and captured? Who's going to pay for it? How does it get to scale, et cetera, et cetera. And that takes a lot more thinking at a systems level, at a market level, at an incentives level. And as investors, we're looking for that. And so part of the learning for me has been, especially with an engineering background, finding that balance between digging into, does the technology work? How does it work? Is the IP defensible? And broadening out to, how does the system work? Where are the incentives? What is the business model here that's going to win? And being able to coach, advise, and find founders who are thinking in similar ways and have compelling answers to those two questions.
Fantastic. And in that, closer to the end of your answer there, I can see some of the elements that might be coming into play with what I wanted to address second there, the second part of your answer, an earlier answer now, because I've asked a few questions on that, but around the transition from an advisory firm into, and as well as a venture capital fund. So tell us about that process, what really fueled that, and then what really drove your decisions to move from advisory to include venture capital.
Yeah, sure. I'll tell a story there that I think brings it to life. When I had been in Australia for a year or maybe a bit longer than that and had started AgThentic and was doing the advisory work, helping to build the AgTech ecosystem here and helping to bring some of the best practices from overseas, but also take advantage of and leverage the great agriculture industry and agricultural research that was happening here in Australia. There was a pitch competition put on by Rabobank and a bunch of entrepreneurs pitched, and I happened to be a judge. My now business partner was also a judge, although I didn't know him well at the time. And one of the companies that pitched was a company called GoTerra. Now, I just mentioned GoTerra before because we've actually invested in them, but this was many years before that. Now, we saw GoTerra pitch and saw how amazing the founder Olympia was, how exciting the business was, albeit a bit raw at the time, and maybe didn't know the playbook of how to pitch and how to raise money and what the startup, playbook really looked like. But I went up to Olympia after and had a chat with her, and long story short, ended up becoming an advisor, and GoTerra did some work with AgThentic. Now, as GoTerra grew and built their strategy, went out to raise money. And it happened that at the same time, AgThentic was having investors call us and say, we're looking for deal flow and opportunities to invest in food and agriculture. And we've heard that you, via the podcast and meetup and all the other stuff we do, have deal flow and have good companies. Who should we meet with? And so we ended up introducing GoTerra to, I think, almost all of their seed round investors that invested in that round. And they went off to raise and have done a bunch of amazing things since then. But at that time, we were seeing this pattern repeat itself where we were advisors, we were able to help companies, but we weren't able to give them what they also need in addition to help, which is money. And at the same time, having those investors say, you guys have deal flow and we want in, it started to light that light bulb of maybe we should raise a fund and actually be able to help these startups with all the conviction and support that we've been giving them, but also with the capital that they need to grow. And so that was the birth of Tenacious Ventures. And at the same time, Matthew, my now business partner and co-founder in Tenacious, joined AgThentic and we launched Tenacious. So now we have the fund and all of our startup activities go through the fund. And that's where we can support and back amazing founders like Olympia.
Excellent. So it sounds like it really was just this emergent element of the work you're doing as an advisory firm through the podcast. And as you mentioned there, around deal flow as well. So that's really interesting to hear that it just came up because things have been going so well and things have been popular. So you've got that deal flow, as you mentioned. I'd like to know how you're taking elements from other businesses. And you mentioned that you grew up in Silicon Valley as well. So that's something that I'm sure that the whole startup world is very just inside you. It's just part of who you are. So that must be part of what's really shaped you into what you're doing today. Are there some elements that you've taken from other businesses that you're now applying into the fund component of your work?
Yeah, I don't know specific businesses, but you're exactly right, James, that I didn't set out to become a venture capitalist. And in fact, I probably would have said that I didn't want to do that. I know when I left grad school, I also said that I wouldn't do consulting or advisory work and then ended up starting an advisory business. So I think don't trust what I say I will or won't do, maybe is the answer. But as a kid, for sure, both my parents were entrepreneurs. And there were times when the dinner table conversation would just focus on business and business decisions or business strategies or work-life balance or managing people. And it didn't really occur to me that was so much a part of who I am and how I think until I started my own businesses and started applying those principles and realizing how naturally that came to me. So it does really go all the way back to where I grew up and my parents' careers as well.
Yeah. What did your parents do as well to have those sorts of conversations at the dinner table?
Yeah, they were both chemical engineers by training, although they ended up being entrepreneurs at various times. They both worked in the semiconductor industry. My mom at various times had started a scrunchie business and various kind of side hustle businesses. And my dad left the corporate world and started his own companies. He's built and sold a couple of them and now works predominantly on the investor side as a kind of hands-on angel. So you can see a few of the threads there that have come full circle for me as well.
I'm sure you've had a lot to learn from your parents then throughout that process. You mentioned semiconductors. I know there's a bit going on. There's a bit of international conversation about semiconductors recently as well, but it sounds like that's long gone. But without sitting around on semiconductors, what are maybe some of the things that you learned that you can now articulate that were important in those formative years from your parents that you're now able to apply a bit more generally in your work?
Yeah, one that comes to mind, I remember as a kid going to my dad's office and he had all those, you probably remember like the super cliche leadership slogans with a picture of the big mountain or a cliff or a bridge or something with the achievement or integrity and I remember at the time thinking those were so cool. And I think at the time they probably were cool, whereas now they would seem perhaps corny. But my dad was always really big on culture and on values. And I found that's just such an important tool to really get that straight. It's helped Matthew and I to get on the same page and make sure we're on the same page about our values, about the company values, about the mission for us, and to use that as a tool and as a motivation for the team to hire great people and help us make sure we're all aligned on the big things we want to achieve and as much as how we want to get there and who we want to be as people in a company. And so maybe we don't have cliche leadership pictures up on the wall, but that original kind of orientation to values and culture and having fun. My dad's company would go out to play video games and he taught a bunch of his team how to play ice hockey, even though they came from countries where there wasn't any ice hockey. And so we do a lot of that kind of fun stuff at the AgThentic group as well, going for runs and swims and going on adventures and going to escape rooms. And I think that stuff's really important as well.
100%. Sarah, what is it that's really giving you friction at the moment that you're dealing with?
At the moment, one thing we're dealing with is in kind of that organic way that the companies grew, starting AgThentic, we ran a program to help producers with innovations and innovative ideas at the farm level that spun out into a company called Farmers to Founders, which is a joint venture of AgThentic. And then having the fund looked at the group of companies a couple months ago and said, we have 3 brands, we've got 3 companies, we've got the podcast, we've got 4 Twitter handles, and there's less than 15 of us. And so having so many brands and not a clear way to unite them probably doesn't make a lot of sense. And so one of the areas we've been thinking a lot about is uniting those brands into what is the AgThentic group and having the AgTech So What brand be our external content platform. So where we have insights and examples and deep dives and Q&As and podcasts and newsletters and all that stuff, but really bringing that brand hierarchy and architecture together so that when someone says, what do? I don't have to tell 4 different stories about 4 different companies and brands. I can just give a more coherent answer and point them to one place to learn more.
So to maybe hopefully not press on a sore spot then, but to kind of make that a little more practical, what do you do when you're at a dinner party and someone asks you what you do? How do you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I would say I work in agriculture technology is how I give that answer. And actually the response is usually, wow, cool. What does that mean? Or do you help farmers or do you farm? Do you build technology? And then we can have the conversation from there. Or they go, oh, cool, that's niche and walk away. And so it tends to be a good, I guess, icebreaker of whether there's any more there.
Well, I find some of those questions are really good to test people to see how interested they are in that sort of conversation as well. Some people give very general, broad answers for that question. What do you do? That's the classic question. And the discourse has changed more to be around why we do what we do, which is not a revolutionary question. And I do ask it on the show every week. It's a classic question to really push behind the driving factors behind that. But on a more practical level, I was interested to know what you say that it is that you do. And thank you for sharing that one.
I was just going to say, one of the challenges now is when they say, oh, what does that mean? What do you actually do? Do you build technology? Is the answer, no, we're advisors, or no, I'm an investor? And that kind of shifting identity from a bunch of different things to really the investment business and supporting amazing entrepreneurs as the focus of what we do and the mission of what we do and the change we want to see in the world. So that's a bit of a brand shift, but also a personal shift in how I answer that question.
And so that's transitioning at the moment, or you're deciding what that's transitioning to. Is that correct?
Yeah, we are investors. We do invest, and that's been super exciting. And really, to go back to your point about leverage, where we see the most opportunity to shift the food system towards carbon neutral and climate change resilience, which is really our mission and the impact we want to have. And so being able to have the advisory business that helps us uncover insights and where we do research to go deep on different topics, but then having the investment business to deploy capital and back companies that are making that change is where actually that leverage comes from.
I'm interested to know just another question around friction, but this is more specific to what you're observing in this can be a specific market or the market more generally, or it could even be in the human condition, something that you're observing as frictional that you are trying to change. I guess we can't change the human condition, but something that you want to change that you're changing.
I would say one thing that's pretty frustrating for me personally is how black and white some of the food system conversations can be, whether that's plant-based milk or regular milk, or whether that's meat versus no meat. Once you've seen how the sausage is made, so to speak, and know how it works upstream and know the different greenhouse gas emissions profiles and how much processed something is or isn't, then the way consumers who maybe don't know as much about the upstream agriculture side of things talk about it as this is good or this is bad is pretty frustrating. And yet, from a human psychology perspective, it's much easier for us to just say good versus bad because then we don't have to think about it anymore. So that kind of how much do we embrace the complexity and how many of those conversations do I want to have with my friends versus knowing that it is really a complex system and that it's natural for us to want to simplify it to be able to not be paralyzed at the grocery store, not buying anything, but instead can order a flat white and get on with our day.
I like that. Sarah, I just have one last question for you today, and that is who would you like to hear on the show?
I would say that having a farmer on the show would be pretty interesting to talk all the way upstream about whether it's regenerative agriculture or whether it's a farmer doing value adding or building their own food brand and selling it direct to consumers or into the hospitality industry. going all the way upstream would be a pretty interesting perspective to hear, and hopefully something of interest to your listeners. Maybe that goes the answer before of I can't help myself but get into some of those more complex issues and get away from black and white. But hearing from a farmer definitely, I think, would be pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of episodes on the show and a few that might hit the mark for you as well, Sarah. So I'll have a chat with you about them later.
Please do. I definitely am not fully caught up.
Awesome. Look, thank you so much for your time today, Sarah. It's been a pleasure having you on the program, and I'm excited to see how things evolve and who else you invest in the future.
Awesome. Thanks so much, James. Really appreciate the opportunity.
This program is hosted by James Henderson, with technical production by Jake Olver. Voiceovers were by Angus Brennan and Shim Phelan. Thanks to our distribution team, and a special thanks to you for tuning in every week. This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.